What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about how to cure common status ailments, so to speak, in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Now, this is primarily geared for new players. We're going to talk about the ones you're going to come across the most often, kind of ways to prevent them, as well as just straight up how to cure them, of course. But before we get into that, I do want to mention two things. For starters, every character has an ability called Treat Affliction. So every one of your party members will have this ability. What Treat Affliction does is makes a lore religion check and attempts to cure something. If you fail that check, which is based, again, off your lore religion skill versus whatever the difficulty class of the ailment is, it will either cure or fail to cure this illness. That's something just handy to know. Sometimes it'll work for you, sometimes it won't. Pretty inconsistent, just because of the nature of the check. Moreover, in every major hub, there is a cleric of some sort that will sell you scrolls. In the early parts of the game, this is a guy named Vincent, I believe it is. In Act 1, he is at the tavern, and in Act 2, he is also at the healer's tent in your camp. Then, when you get to your main town hub, it actually switches to a person called Arseno, who is just outside of the temple as well. This is important because these are the people you will go see when you actually need a lot of these ailments cured, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. I just wanted to mention the location of these people in your town hub. So with that out of the way, let's actually jump into some of the conditions. First up, the obvious two, Death and Death's Door. Depending on the difficulty you're playing on, for starters, if you're on Casual and below, Casual or Story, all you got to do to cure basically everything is Rest, because on that difficulty, everything is removed on Rest. And then, if you are on, I believe it is Core or above, you don't see Death's Door at all, meaning that if your characters die, which is to say they take negative damage more than their Constitution score, they just die. Whereas if you have Death's Door on, you basically get a freebie, where that character will have taken fatal damage, but instead be given a condition called Death's Door. Death's Door basically means you used your freebie, and if you die again, that character will be actually dead, which means you'll have to resurrect them. If your main character dies, it's just game over. But your companions and things can die and be resurrected. Which brings us to Death. The way that you cure Death is the Raise Dead spell, or the Resurrection spell. Resurrection is just an improved version of Raise Dead. Raise Dead's kind of the minimum, which kind of just brings them back as they were, with barely a little sliver of health, whereas Resurrection brings them back fully healed, basically. Now, the primary way you're probably going to do this is scrolls. However, later in the game, it is possible to have party members who can cast Raise Dead. These are typically clerics or any divine caster who can potentially get these spells. But Raise Dead can be performed by a companion. However, otherwise, you'll go to one of these clerics in town, buy a Raise Dead scroll for 6,000 gold, and just have that character that is dead use it, and then ta-da, they're back to life. And then we have Blind. Blind is annoying, but very simple to cure. Blind is permanent, meaning that if your character failed a check against a blind status effect, like the spell Blind, they will be blinded. The easiest way to deal with this is, of course, go buy a Remove Blindness scroll, which has no checks of any sort. You just use the scroll and you're automatically cured. It is also possible to have the spell Remove Blindness on a companion as well, which can make this pretty easy to deal with. That brings us to Disease. Diseases are annoying. Now, if you're lucky, you can use Treat Affliction on them and get rid of them. However, diseases, once they've been caught, have a very high DC to actually remove with Treat Affliction. Otherwise, it might be more difficult to remove. These can be removed with a Remove Disease wand, a Remove Disease spell, or a Remove Disease scroll. However, just using the scroll is not good enough, which is what makes the disease effects really annoying, actually. So diseases are ongoing, where your character can either make certain saves to eventually be cured of it just over time naturally, but every so often, like a frequency per day kind of thing, that disease will make a check that then usually deals some sort of ability damage to you, which we'll get into next. And overall, they're very frustrating. In fact, on core difficulty, it's possible to get diseases you cannot cure at the level that you are simply because making the check is impossible. Because Remove Disease has a caster check associated with it, which is a d20 plus the caster level of the person casting the scroll or the spell, which will then go up against the difficulty class of the disease itself. It's possible to buy a Remove Disease scroll or use a Remove Disease spell, use it on someone with the disease, and not actually cure it, which can be incredibly annoying. But nonetheless, that's how you get rid of that one. Next up, we have ability damage. This comes in temporary and permanent. Temporary can typically be healed simply by resting, and then there is permanent ability damage, which requires a restoration scroll typically to actually cure. These can again be used as scrolls from the clerics or spells from your companions, but basically restoration is what you are looking for, which is why it's always handy to have scrolls of restoration or greater restoration just on you when you're out and about adventuring. Now, some of the other things restoration can cure is actually negative levels. Negative levels are very frustrating. If you take more negative levels than you have hit die, your character will just die outright. Speaking of, if your ability damage, if you take ability damage to one of your ability scores, that is to say your strength, constitution, etc., that brings that stat to 0, that character dies. Restoration can cure both of these things. Negative levels also come in timed and permanent variants. If it's timed, if it's a really short timer, you might just want to wait it out. However, if it's the 24-hour one or the permanent one, you're going to want to use a restoration scroll. However, in combat, that's not really good enough for negative levels because you can take so many very quickly and just die outright from the negative levels. So what's usually better to do in that case is use a spell called Death's Ward, which prevents negative levels as well as gives you a +4 to the roll against death effects. Now, if you catch a few negative levels from like a ghost or something, because ghosts and Nabasu tend to be the ones giving you negative levels, if it's just a couple, you can cure it with a restoration scroll. But if you're dying in a situation to negative levels a lot, the best scenario is usually to use Death Ward so that character just stops taking them. And then that brings us to Curse. You don't see a lot of curses in Wrath of the Righteous, but occasionally they do come up. Very similarly to the disease effect, you can just buy a scroll or have someone use Remove Curse as a spell. That then makes a d20 plus the caster level check of the scroll or spell, and then it tries to remove the curse. Then there are poisons. Poisons can usually be removed by Remove Poison, or, of course, the Remove Poison spell. It is also possible to suppress their effects occasionally, but again, Treat Affliction can also be used here. But I would say, in my experience, once that character has been poisoned, it's usually too late until the actual poison effect stops, and then you cure the ability damage or something. Poison will usually lead to ability damage before it wears off, and you just have to make sure that character doesn't die from the ability damage, which is usually your main concern there. And then last but not least, I want to mention Confusion and Insanity. You see Confusion come up a lot above, I believe it's normal, like above normal. You'll start seeing the Vescivore swarms in Act 2 confuse your characters. Confuse itself isn't that bad. Basically, confusion will cause your character to make a roll, and then depending on the range of that roll, your character will perform one of a few actions. They might behave normally, it might attack itself, it might attack someone else, it might do nothing. But it's only got a very short timer, confusion that is. And then there is Insanity. Insanity is basically the permanent version of confusion. Your options here are basically Greater Restoration or the Heal spell. Insanity is rare. Typically what you're going to get is confusion, but occasionally a character can actually get insanity. And it's important to know how you can cure that if you don't just choose to reload that fight, because insanity is one of the more annoying ones. Because while that character can continue to travel with you, obviously they're going to behave very unpredictably. So that's one you want to deal with pretty quick. There you go, guys. There is a video on how to cure common status ailments in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. If you have any questions, leave them down below. If you have any other ailments you're curious about, leave them down below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I hope you found it informational and it answered some of your questions. If it did, remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.